The question echoed across the silent, frost-coated Ardennes Forest like the whisper of a ghost. Snow swallowed footsteps, breath crystallized in the air, and every branch drooped beneath a weight heavier than ice. Fear. 19-year-old Daniel Mercer crouched behind a pine, his gloves too thin and his courage even thinner. As an artillery spotter for the U.S. Army, his eyes were his weapon, his radio, his lifeline. But tonight, something in the air pressed down on him, a sensation he couldn't name. Across the valley, German troops hid behind logs and dugouts. They were murmuring to one another, low voices trembling. They couldn't understand how American shells kept landing impossibly close to their positions. Daniel didn't understand either, but he felt the gears of fate turning, and the forest felt like a place holding its breath. Daniel never imagined himself wearing a uniform. Back in Maine, he dreamed of chalkboards, not carbines, novels, not artillery shells. His mother used to read to him at night, Dickens, Hemingway, Twain. "Stories show us who we are," she'd said. War showed him something else entirely. Good eyesight had earned him a place as a forward observer. He could pick out distant shapes through fog, snow, or smoke better than most. But inside he felt like a child pretending at bravery while the world burned. Lieutenant Jack Collins was the opposite, square-jawed, thunder-voiced, the kind of man who seemed carved from battlefield grit. He trusted Daniel's judgment, sometimes more than Daniel trusted himself. But tonight, Daniel sensed something coming, a decision, a turning point, a moment he wasn't prepared for, and war doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. On the German line, another young man struggled with the same cold, the same confusion, the same fear. Lukas Adler, 20 and bone-tired, knelt in frozen mud as his commander barked orders over the moaning wind. But Lukas barely heard him. His mind kept returning to one thought. How do they know? The men whispered theories like children whispering ghost stories. Maybe they captured one of our scouts. No, maybe the Americans have devices, machines that can hear us. Are we cursed? Lukas didn't believe in curses. He believed in simple things: bread, music, laughter, things the war had stolen. But something about the Americans' precision chilled him more than the snow, because it didn't feel random. It felt personal. Daniel lifted his binoculars again as the German squad shifted behind a fallen tree. He could see their breath floating like ghosts in the frigid air. He thumbed the radio. "This is Sparrow 2. Coordinates incoming." He rattled off numbers. Cold, clinical numbers. A minute later, the forest erupted. Shells slammed into the earth with violent cracks that shook the ground. Trees burst into splinters. Snow vaporized in clouds of white dust. Daniel flinched. Lieutenant Collins gave him a firm pat. "Solid call, Mercer. Saved our boys from a nasty surprise." Daniel forced a nod, but guilt pooled in his stomach like ice water. No matter how many times he told himself, "It's war," a quiet voice whispered back, "They're people." Daniel never told anyone about his mother's gift, her fluency in German, her insistence that he learn it too. She taught him songs first, then poems, then sentences. "Understanding a language," she'd told him, "is understanding the heart that speaks it." He never expected her lessons to matter. But last night, through the wind, he heard voices, German soldiers speaking freely, thinking themselves safely hidden. And he understood every word: plans, locations, complaints, fears. Daniel hadn't intended to use the knowledge, but when the next artillery strike proved eerily accurate, guilt tugged at him harder than the cold. What terrified him wasn't how much he heard, it was how much he understood. It began innocently, a phrase drifting across the snow, a sentence carried by the breeze. But soon Daniel realized a hard truth. The Germans didn't whisper softly enough. Sometimes he heard a full conversation. Sometimes the key detail, the ridge, the cave, the repositioning for a nighttime push. He didn't decode codes. He didn't intercept transmissions. He simply listened. Lieutenant Collins noticed. "Kid, you're reading their movements like a damn book." "How?" Daniel swallowed. "Just paying attention, sir." He didn't know whether admitting the truth would make him valuable, suspicious, or dangerous. So he kept it to himself. One conversation haunted him. Two German soldiers spoke anxiously about a small cave downriver where a medic named Clara Weiss treated wounded men. She wasn't military. She wasn't a threat. She had volunteered only because everyone she loved had been pulled into the war. Daniel pictured her working by candlelight, hands cracked and bleeding from cold, trying to keep strangers alive. He knew what the Americans would do if they learned about the cave. It would be marked as an enemy shelter point, and it would be shelled. A civilian, a healer, innocents hiding in the cold. Daniel's stomach twisted until he thought he might be sick. Suddenly, his gift didn't feel like an advantage. It felt like a moral crossroads. Lukas trudged through ankle-deep snow with 3 others, carrying a wounded man toward that very cave. His breath puffed rhythmically as he fought numbness creeping into his fingers. Clara met them at the entrance, her lantern barely illuminating her worried face. "Inside, quickly," she urged. "His pulse is weak." Lukas watched her work with quiet awe. In a world tearing itself apart, she stitched pieces back together. He wondered why people like her weren't the ones making decisions. Then, as he looked back toward the American lines, fear coiled in his chest. If the Americans learned about this cave, they would destroy it without hesitation. But Lukas couldn't know that someone on the other side already had, and that someone was listening right now. Daniel froze as he heard the German words drifting through the trees. Panic surged through him. If he called in the coordinates, Clara and the wounded would die. If he didn't, he'd be disobeying protocol and risking American lives. Lieutenant Collins approached. "What do you see, Mercer?" Daniel hesitated, just for a moment. Then he said the truth. "Sir, I think there are civilians in that cave. A medic. Non-combatants." Collins's expression hardened. "We're here to take out enemy positions, not babysit their medics." "But she's helping wounded. She's not armed." "Kid," Collins lowered his voice, "war doesn't give us the luxury of exceptions." Daniel felt a heat rising in his chest, a heat that wasn't anger but conviction. Maybe it should. Collins's jaw clenched. "Give me the coordinates." Daniel stared at the radio. This was the moment he'd felt coming, and everything inside him screamed, "No." Daniel inhaled a sharp breath. Snowflakes landed on his eyelashes, melting instantly. Collins stood beside him, waiting. Daniel thumbed the radio, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Sparrow 2, fire mission, coordinates to follow." He read the numbers aloud, but they were wrong, shifted just enough to hit an empty stretch of forest instead of the cave. A perfect lie disguised as a perfect call. Seconds later, the artillery roared. The blasts shook the ground, but Daniel knew he had spared them. Lieutenant Collins cursed. "Damn shells landed off target. Double-check your instruments next time." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." But as the thunder faded, he felt something warm beneath his ribs. Not pride, not relief. A sense of reclaiming something the war had tried to take from him. His humanity. The German troops were shaken. The shells had landed so close they'd all braced to die. Yet somehow, impossibly, the fire had missed the cave entirely. A squad leader shouted, "This makes no sense. Whoever's working the American guns is either incompetent or playing with us." But Lukas didn't think they were being played. He had felt something in the air last night, a hesitation like someone watching them with a conflicted heart. One of the older soldiers muttered, "Maybe God intervened." The commander scoffed. God picks sides now? But Lukas looked back at the distant tree line. What he felt didn't feel like divine intervention. It felt like mercy. And mercy, in his experience, only came from people, never from war. That night, the sky tore open. A brutal blizzard swept across the Ardennes with a vengeance. Snow slammed sideways like shards of glass. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. Daniel's unit attempted to relocate to a safer observation point, but the storm was relentless. Wind punched them backward. Snow swallowed their tracks as soon as they made them. Lieutenant Collins shouted into the storm, "This is suicide. We need shelter." But the forest was a maze. Landmarks disappeared. Trees looked like blank, identical ghosts. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. His face burned with cold, then went frighteningly numb. After an hour of stumbling through white oblivion, the lieutenant collapsed face first into the drifts. Daniel grabbed his shoulders. "Sir, get up, please." Collins's voice was barely a whisper. "Kid, I can't feel anything." Daniel looked around, desperation clawing at him. If they didn't find shelter soon, the storm would bury them alive. For the first time since arriving in Europe, Daniel felt the icy fingers of death reaching for him. On the German side of the forest, chaos unfolded in the same blinding storm. Lucas's group struggled to keep their footing as they carried more wounded to the cave. Clara fought to keep the lantern lit, her hands trembling. "Stop here," she shouted. "We're losing him. He barely has a pulse." Lukas looked at the soldier's ashen face. "We need real shelter. The cave is too far." Clara's eyes darted across the blinding storm until she spotted faint lights flickering through the snowfall. "Over there," Lukas squinted. The lights didn't look German, but they had no choice. If they stayed in the storm, they'd die before the enemy ever had to fire a shot. With no weapons drawn, carrying an unconscious man, Lukas led the group toward the unfamiliar glow. Daniel was half dragging, half carrying Lieutenant Collins through the storm when he saw it, shapes moving toward them. At first he thought it was a hallucination. Then his heart seized. German soldiers. He fumbled for his rifle, but his frost-bitten fingers moved sluggishly. Collins was barely conscious. The German figures came closer, and then Daniel noticed something. Their hands were raised, and one of them shouted through the storm in broken English, "Help! We have wounded!" Daniel's instinct screamed danger, but his heart pulled him in another direction. Clara rushed forward, gesturing frantically. "He will die out here. Please, let us help him." Daniel swallowed hard. Everything he'd been taught said no, but everything he believed whispered yes. He lowered his rifle first, slowly, cautiously. Everyone else followed. In the middle of a battlefield, enemies chose not to be enemies, and for a brief moment, the storm felt less cold. They found an old hunter's cabin half buried beneath snowdrifts. The roof sagged and the windows rattled, but inside was warmth, a dying fireplace, a few old blankets, and space enough for both groups. Clara immediately took charge, ordering both Americans and Germans where to place the wounded. Her voice was sharp, confident, compassionate. Daniel watched her hands move with purpose, stitching frost-bitten skin, warming frozen limbs. He had never seen anything so brave. Lieutenant Collins regained consciousness slowly. When he realized Germans were in the room, he tried to reach for his pistol. Daniel pressed his hand down. "They saved us, and we saved them." Collins stared at him, really stared. Then something softened in his eyes. For now there were no orders, no flags, no sides, just people trying to survive a storm bigger than their hatred. Hours passed. The storm howled outside like a wounded animal, but the cabin remained a fragile island of peace. The two groups sat across from each other, unsure how to behave. Eventually, hunger overcame pride. Lukas pulled a small loaf of dark bread from his pack, breaking it into pieces. He held one out to Daniel. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. "Thank you," Lukas nodded. "Tonight, no war." Daniel offered a tin of American rations in return. "Trade?" Lukas cracked a small smile. "Trade." Clara tended to the last of the wounded before finally sitting between them, exhaustion etched into her face. Daniel looked around the cramped cabin and realized something profound. War wasn't made by soldiers, it was endured by them. Tonight, they weren't warriors. They were simply human. When the storm finally broke, the sun rose slowly, cautiously, as if unsure the world deserved light again. German and American soldiers stepped outside, blinking into the pale morning. Lukas tightened his scarf. "We go east, you go west. No shots." Lieutenant Collins exhaled, his breath forming clouds. After a long pause, he nodded. "No shots." Daniel felt a lump forming in his throat. He didn't want this to end. It felt wrong that peace had to be temporary. Lukas extended a hand. "Daniel Mercer." Daniel clasped it. "Lukas Adler." Two boys shaking hands in a war they never asked for. Clara hugged both of them, quick, warm, motherly. "Stay alive," she whispered, "both of you." Then, without another word, the groups turned their separate ways, and Daniel felt like he was leaving behind a piece of himself. Just as Daniel was turning away, Lukas jogged back to him. He pressed something into Daniel's hand, a tiny carved wooden angel with wings smooth from years of handling. "My mother made it," Lukas said softly. "For protection." Daniel stared at the angel, speechless. "I can't take this." "You must," Lukas insisted, "because I believe you will return it to me. After the war." Daniel swallowed hard. "Then you need to survive too." Lukas nodded. "That is the promise." As Lukas returned to his group, Daniel squeezed the wooden angel until it pressed into his palm, a fragile symbol of hope in a world built on destruction. Weeks later, German intelligence officers still debated the impossible. Maps covered tables, officers argued, shouted, pounded fists. How did the Americans always know where we were hiding? Someone betrayed us. No, someone intercepted our transmissions. But Lukas kept silent. He knew the truth. There was no traitor, no miracle technology, no ghost in the forest, just a young American who spoke their language and listened not with his ears, but with his heart, because understanding an enemy was the first step toward seeing them as human, and humanity was a power stronger than any artillery. 20 years passed, the war ended, borders changed, children grew up in peaceful streets, but some memories never faded. In a quiet town in Maine, Daniel Mercer, now a teacher, sat grading papers while his students played outside. A knock sounded on the classroom door. Daniel stood and opened it. A man waited there. Older, scarred by time, eyes filled with an emotion Daniel couldn't place. In his hand was a tiny wooden angel. Daniel's breath caught. "Lukas." Lukas smiled, voice trembling. "I told you. We would meet again." Daniel pulled him into a fierce embrace. "God, I thought I'd never see you again." Lukas stepped back, wiping his eyes. "I found your name in a small American newspaper, a story about a teacher who once served as a forward observer. I knew it had to be you." Daniel laughed, tears streaming freely. "And you kept the angel?" "No," Lukas said softly, placing it back into Daniel's hand. "You kept it safe, for both of us. Now it is home." Daniel closed his fingers around the small carving, feeling warmth radiate from it. Two men, once enemies, now brothers, forged not by war, but by the refusal to let war define them. And in that quiet classroom, Daniel realized something. A single act of kindness can echo across decades, changing enemies into friends, fear into hope, and history into something more human.